Welcome to Over There, Americans at War in World War I, Part 2, an online U.S. history tutorial for students in 11th grade. The soldiers of the AEF were a diverse group that reflected the American population. More than 350,000 soldiers were African Americans who had volunteered for the war or were drafted. Black soldiers served only with each other in segregated units commanded by white officers. Their training tended to be more haphazard than that of whites, and they faced widespread prejudice about their abilities as soldiers. One official Army report stated that the mass of the colored drafted men cannot be used for combatant troops. So in Europe, most of these men were assigned to non-combat positions behind the lines, performing manual labor and transporting supplies. But two African American divisions saw major combat, and one of them, the 93rd Division, actually served under French command. France's army was near the point of mutiny by 1918, so the French asked for and received black troops to bolster their ranks. It was one of the few times that General Pershing allowed AEF soldiers to serve under foreign commanders. In almost every way, soldiers of the 93rd Division were treated better and more respectfully by the French military than they were by their own. It was a refreshing and eye-opening experience for the men. One of the most distinguished units to serve was the 369th Infantry Regiment, nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters. They served on the front lines for over 6 months and earned a war record equal to any other American infantry unit in the war. 171 members of the regiment, including those you see here, were awarded either the Legion of Honor or the Croix de Guerre, France's highest honors for bravery and valor. Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans also served in the AEF. Unlike African Americans, they were not always segregated into their own units, but like the black soldiers, they were generally given non-combat assignments. Some Hispanics found that if they Americanized their last names, they were treated better and given more opportunities. By contrast, Native Americans who volunteered for the AEF, as many as 12,000, generally served alongside white soldiers in traditional combat units. Some Choctaw warriors were employed as code talkers to send sensitive messages that their German opponents couldn't understand. Women participated in the war in ways both traditional and new. Thousands volunteered for humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross, YMCA, and Salvation Army. But World War I marked the first time that military nurses for the Army and Navy, more than 10,000 of them, were sent overseas. Only women were allowed to join the nursing corps at this time. And most significantly, for the first time ever, women were allowed to officially enlist in the Navy, the Marines, and even for a handful of women, the Coast Guard. Women did not serve in combat, but worked primarily clerical office jobs that freed up male sailors and Marines to go to war. These yeoman recruits received the same pay and benefits as men and were treated as veterans after the war. Only the Army refused to officially enlist women, instead relying on them as volunteers and contract employees. In many cases, minorities who served in World War I experienced increased opportunities and equality. This was especially true for African Americans, many of whom were treated by the French as the heroes they were, and for women who worked important jobs outside the home and even in the military. When they returned home to the United States after the war, many minorities were disappointed to see their opportunities shrink, as they were expected to return to their normal pre-war roles. Some became newly determined to fight for equality. 1918 was the last year of World War I, and the only year in which the American Expeditionary Force would play a major role in the fighting. American troops would play a decisive role in bringing the war to an end. In March, Russia's new communist government officially withdrew from the war after signing a separate peace treaty with Germany. This freed up Germany to shift troops from its eastern border, where it was no longer battling Russians, to the western front in France. German soldiers now launched the biggest assault of the war and smashed a hole in the Allied lines. Shells fell on Paris, launched from enemy artillery only 80 miles away. Germany's military leadership realized that now was its best opportunity to end the war before America could fully commit its troops. In response, General Pershing finally committed the AEF under his own command to the central zone of combat. In May and June, Americans clashed with Germans at the Battle of Cantigny and Château-Thierry. AEF soldiers were daring and eager for action, and they succeeded in stopping the German advance towards Paris. But casualties were high. General Pershing initially scorned the defensive tactics that the other allies had adopted, and the Americans who attempted daring charges at the enemy realized what the British and French had learned years ago. In the Great War, daring often meant dead. At the Battle of Belleau Wood, a June battle that went on for weeks, American and Allied troops engaged in deadly hand-to-hand combat in a forested area before expelling the Germans there. The Germans used poison mustard gas in the course of the battle. 1,800 Americans died, and more than 4 times as many were wounded, for a total of almost 10,000 casualties. Every American who fought in the battle received the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor. The AEF's performance impressed not just their allies, but also their enemies. The Americans' nerves are not yet worn out, noted a German report. Another German officer called the U.S. the decisive power in the war. The fresh blood the United States brought to the war really made a difference at a time when German morale was close to the breaking point. By the summer, the Allies were on the offensive, launching a massive counteroffensive along the Western Front that would push the Germans east and eventually win the war. In September, more than 1 million AEF troops participated in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The campaign lasted for 47 days until Germany's government signed an armistice, a ceasefire, on November 11th. It was the biggest, deadliest battle in American history up to that time. 117,000 were killed or wounded. For the soldiers of the AEF who fought in World War I and lived to return home, their wartime experience was brief, intense, and ultimately successful. Of the 2 million or so troops in Europe at the time of the armistice, most, about 1.4 million, saw action. More than 200,000 survived, but suffered injuries that ranged from scars to missing limbs to permanent psychological disabilities like shell shock. Those who had been exposed to poison gas had some of the worst injuries. About 116,500 Americans did not return home. They died on the battlefields of Europe or in hospitals of wounds or disease. 25,000 of them had died from a terrible influenza epidemic, the so-called Spanish flu, that devastated the world beginning in 1918. Up until this point in American history, only the Civil War had cost the lives of so many. It should be noted, though, that compared to the other Allied and Central Powers that had been fighting for over 4 years, the U.S. got off easy. The British had lost almost 1 million men, France had lost about 1.5 million, and Germany had lost over 2 million. The doughboys who returned home to the United States were changed by their experiences. Some became cynical and disillusioned. They had experienced the horrors of war and seen friends die. They wondered, naturally, what it had all been for and if their sacrifice had been worth it. But a greater number, recent research suggests, took mostly positive things away from their experience. Soldiers were given questionnaires to fill out when they left the Army, and their frank responses indicate that the majority felt pride in their service and felt they had fought for duty, honor, and their country. Many Americans who would go on to lead famous lives served in World War I, both in the AEF and in other capacities. Here are 4 that you may recognize. Walt Disney, the famous film producer and creator of Mickey Mouse, tried to enlist in the Navy in 1918, but he was only 16 and in high school. The minimum age of enlistment was 17. So Disney lied about his age and joined the Red Cross Ambulance Corps, which was easier for him to get into. Walt wasn't actually sent over there until a month after the fighting ended, but he spent about a year in France driving ambulances and serving as a chauffeur and guide for Army officials. He drew sketches and cartoons constantly during his time overseas. The famous actor Humphrey Bogart, known for starring roles in movies like Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon, joined the U.S. Navy in 1918. Bogey served on the transport ship Leviathan and was reported to be a model sailor. He served most of his time at sea after the war's end, helping to ferry troops back home from Europe. Bogart remembered his service fondly. At 18, war was great stuff. Paris, sexy French girls, hot dog. Ernest Hemingway was one of the most famous American authors of the 20th century. He wrote novels like The Sun Also Rises and The Old Man and the Sea. Hemingway tried to join the Army but was rejected because of his poor eyesight, so he joined the Red Cross Ambulance Corps and served in Italy. In July 1918, Hemingway was badly wounded in his legs by shrapnel, but he was awarded a medal for dragging another soldier to safety. He recuperated for 6 months before returning home. Several of the famous stories Hemingway would later write are inspired by his experiences in World War I. Future U.S. President Harry Truman was in his 30s when he served as the battery commander of an artillery regiment on the Western Front. Once, when his soldiers began to flee while under attack by Germans, Truman apparently called them back using such colorful profanity that the men, shocked, actually stayed and fought. Truman's battery fired some of the last shots of the war on November 11, 1918, the day the fighting ended in an armistice. The regiment didn't lose a single man in France while under Truman's command. The future president credited his wartime experience with bringing out his leadership skills and transforming his life.